right, so welcome to today's call, the Citizens and Emergency Preparedness. Before we begin the discussion, I'd just like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous lands. As settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all generations of Indigenous people who have taken care of this land. As settlers, this recognition of the contributions to historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. And our agenda today, we would like to welcome everybody to introduce themselves in the chat box. Which I will get to in one moment. We are going to have several presenters, Blake Poland, Imara Rolston, Anne Gloger, and Ismail Afra, talk to us today, or start off our conversation on rethinking resilience, a community-centered approach. We'll leave time for questions and discussion, and I'll close with a couple of learning opportunities. And just as a reminder, the purpose of this community of practice is to build connections with those who are working to involve citizens in emergency preparedness, response, and recovery. And this is really your space to be able to share with one another best practices, lessons learned, and resources that you guys are finding helpful. I would like to just introduce myself. I'm a manager of cities with Cities Reducing Poverty. I did administer this community of practice for a little while, a couple of years ago, but it's been quite a while. Heather and Christine are both away today, so I'm just stepping in to administer, and I thank you for welcoming me into your space today, but I'm going to be learning along with you guys, and I'm very excited to. So please just, share your name, your organization, where you're calling in from. And again, one word that comes to mind when you think about community resilience. And we can get some introductions in the chat box. But I would like to introduce everybody to our speaker today, Blake Poland. Blake is an associate professor of the Dalalana School of Public Health, Director of Collaborative Specialization and Community Development, co-director of the WHO Collaborating Center in Health Promotion, co-lead of the DLSPH Healthier Cities and Communities Hub, and a past program director for the SBHS PhD and MPH health promotion programs. He's trained in social and health geography. Blake's research has focused on the settings approach to health promotion, the health of marginalized groups, the sociology of tobacco control, and community development as an arena of practice for health professionals. More recently, his attention has turned to ecological public health, community resilience, urban sustainability transition, social movements as agents of change, and authentic dialogue as a tool for transformative learning. So Blake, I will share your bio. It is quite long and impressive, but why don't I hand it over to you to introduce today's presenters.
Thank you, Natasha. There'll be a few of us today, so we agreed we would introduce ourselves. So really happy to have the following folks with us. And Imara, I think you're there online if you want to come on and introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. It's good afternoon. My name is Imara Rolston. I work with the city's Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit. I also worked on the team to develop the city's first climate resilience strategy, which I'll be talking a bit about. And I'm leading the development at Dalalana, the development of a community climate resilience lab. So I'm really happy to be here with you all to talk about some of our work.
Thank you. And Anne, are you on the line now?
I am. I'm Anne Gloger, and I am the founding director of the East Scarborough Storefront, the genesis of the Connected Community approach, as well as the principal for the Center for Connected Communities. And I've had the privilege and honor of working with Imara, Blake, and Ismail on a numerous number of initiatives, all focused on community-centered resilience. And I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. And Ismail?
Hi, my name is Ishmael Afra. I'm coming from the Regent Park Neighborhood Association. I am their community coordinator, and I'm also a member of the Local Champions Network. This is a network that's been created through the Toronto Strong Neighborhood Strategy, and the idea is how do you bring voices of equity-seeking neighborhoods through city-informed strategies. And I'm really happy to talk to you about collaboration and the connected community approach in solving citywide issues. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Natasha, can you enable Anne to share slides? She's got the slide deck with her.
Yes, Rute, are you able to share your
I
screen?
think I'm good. I
Oh,
think I got it. Let's just see if this is going to work.
yeah, we can see your screen.
Great,
Excellent, excellent,
thank you.
excellent.
We have a whole bunch of stuff queued up for you. This is the outcome of several years of working together, and it's just been such a delightful collaboration. And I've been a member of this group for a little while, and it's often struck me that what we've been doing would be of interest to this group. So it's really a lovely opportunity to bring some of that material forward. Next slide, please. I think we can go to the next one.
That.
Yeah. So one of the ways that we've anchored our work, we got a CIHR grant to do a literature review on the role of community in disaster response and community resilience. And as many of you know, much of the focus in emergency preparedness is on hard infrastructure rather than so-called soft infrastructure or the social infrastructure that is so critical. And at the same time, we know that marginalized communities are often the hardest hit in disaster, and that formal system responses are often slower than civil society responses. So citizens mobilize right away when a crisis hits. But when the formal system kicks into gear, it often parachutes in and runs roughshod over informal local efforts, completely ignoring or oblivious to what's been happening on the ground. And so there have been many calls in the literature for more and better collaboration and integration between citizen groups and initiatives on the one hand and formal institutions on the other, whether that's from the city or disaster response or what have you, but actually very little guidance about how to do this and how to do it well. Next slide, please. And so part of what we're seeing is a push to bring a community-centered resilience approach into emergency preparedness. And this is from an article by Yashir Pines et al. I won't read all the pieces out to you there, but really it's emphasizing the importance of not only including community, but increasingly reorienting efforts at preparing, responding, and regrouping after crises and in crises to center the voices and experience and needs, et cetera, of community, knowing that they're really the experts on their local situation. Next slide, please.
I just want to, hi everybody, it's Imara. I'm just jumping in to share some reflections on the Toronto Resilience Strategy and our process. Top of line, what we knew as the Toronto Resilience team, City Toronto Resilience team, is that there was a deep connection between equity and community-centered resilience. We started to develop our strategy as a part of a family of the 100 RC Rockefeller Foundation network of cities that were also developing their resilience strategies at the same time or before us. And what we started to see from Boston was a focus on racial justice. What we started to see from St. Louis was a focus on the Ferguson Commission post the murder of Mike Brown. And we started to see in Tulsa a resilience strategy that really started to focus on not just racial justice, but the difficult history of Tulsa where it comes to systemic racist dispossession. And so as a strategy in particular, we knew that we had to start the conversation differently. We knew that we couldn't just have a top-down conversation about what resilience, climate resilience in particular is. And so as a result, we decided to start that conversation with our folks at Connected Communities and local champions, local leaders who are experts, consultants, leaders in their communities to craft a resident up a framework of what resilience should look like. And so we talked to thousands of people across the city through community conversations, through town halls, through every method you could think of. And what bubbled to the surface is that the tale that we keep hearing about our city becoming more income polarized, more racially polarized, the fact that our city speaks of growth, but struggles to acknowledge the massive amounts of marginalization that we see in different parts of our city is core to doing resilience work. And so that means that equity has to be at the forefront and people have to be at the forefront of any sort of resilience initiative. Next slide. And so as a result, if you look at the resilience strategy, out of 6 of our recommendations, 3 are really people-oriented strategies, civic engagement, equity, which I spoke about, communities and neighborhoods. And what we, when you dig into those parts of the strategy, what you keep on seeing pop up is the need to center communities, the need to center resident leaders in this process, because leaders and residents have the most intimate relationships with where we need to build and where the power and possibility is for more resilient futures. Next slide. Now, as a city staff member, the interrelationship between communities and cities often happens at the point of our strategies. So we have a number of strategies from a community-centered climate resilience standpoint that can be leveraged to move this sort of focus forward. Because as a city, I think what we have to think about is how do we create a sort of resilience-enabling environment for community-centered resilience. And so, we're talking about leveraging strategies like and coordinating strategies like the Toronto Strong Neighborhood Strategy, the Senior Strategy, Poverty Reduction Strategy, the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Strategy, all strategies that have pieces of the pie when it comes to creating that enabling environment for community-centered resilience. Next slide, Anne. But when we talk about and when we reference these strategies, really what we're talking about is almost a whole city response to community-centered resilience and climate resilience or resilience building writ large within the city. Because when we talk about these strategies, we're implicating a number of divisions. So we're not just talking about emergency services. We're talking about the Toronto Public Libraries that play a critical role in communities. We're talking about planning and the way planning reshapes the city. We're talking about parks, forestry, and rec, public health. All these cities working together as a collective coordinated ecosystem in conjunction with resident leadership. Next slide. And so to that point, through the leadership of Connected Communities and a number of other folks within the city, we all got together in early 2020 before the pandemic to think collectively about what a theory of change for supporting community-based resilience could look like. What would it look like to help the city prepare, respond, recover, regroup, and mitigate not just climate change, but also all the other shocks that we might face. And this is before we knew that COVID was upon us. And so the theory of change that we came up with as a group, and I think Anne will speak to this more. We had a lot of people in the room coming from different parts of our city. What we came up with was this theory of change that sort of weaves together an ecosystem of city actors, leaders, and institutions in community together to build community-centered climate resilience, but with a really clear commitment to a number of guiding principles. And those guiding principles being equity, empathy, the power of communities, asset-based approach to this work, etc. And that with those guiding principles, you can have this interwoven ecosystems approach that enhances and creates that enabling environment for community-centered climate resilience.
So one of the aspects that Amara touched on, I think, is really key here, because often resilience is the natural state of affairs were it not for various systemic forms of marginalization that complicate the efforts of citizens and the background conditions that they have to work with. And so one of the issues that's been coming more and more front and center in the resilience literature has been the need to reframe resilience as not just the capacity to bounce back from adversity, back to some implied normal, but in fact recognize that what we take as normal is in fact deeply dysfunctional, both ecologically and socially, and that we need to be thinking also about resilience in terms of the capacity to embrace change and bounce forward into new ways of thinking and doing. and one of the key
What song?
pieces involved in in that
Nothing to
work.
touch electronics right now.
We've got, oh, there we go. Thank you.
Just a
It's a game of
reminder,
whack-a-mole with the mute
just a
button.
reminder to keep yourself on mute if you're not talking right now. Thank you.
Thank you. So just to emphasize here that part of the equity work that Amara was talking about means rethinking and re-engineering over time the nature of the relationship between city and citizens, and reconfiguring that with the voices and experience of community more at the center. Next slide, please. And if we look at the track that resilience work has been on over time, we see, whether it's from this case of the Netherlands with flood prevention or other examples, that in fact we tend to do this recovery to quote unquote normal over and over again until we realize that's really not satisfactory, and we move towards a stance that's more oriented to transformational change. Next slide, please.
So Imara was talking about the process to develop the City of Toronto resilience strategy. And I was part of a number of those initiatives, and over and over and over again, what I kept hearing was connection, connected communities. And of course, that's key to the kind of work that we were doing in various other spheres across other domains, and realizing how the connected community approach is absolutely core to being able to prepare for, respond to, recover from, regroup after, and thus bounce forward from major shocks. So the connected community approach hinges on two things. One is the understanding of a place-based ecosystem, that neighborhoods have an ecosystem where people are driving forward initiatives to strengthen their own community. And every community is an ecosystem full of grassroots groups, social services organizations, city divisions, faith communities, businesses, and in virtually every community I've ever run across, these groups in some way or another are networked in order to try to drive forward a community-led agenda. The connected community approach is really the intentional focus on leveraging assets, connections, communications in order that the social fabric of the community can work better to support an ever evolving strengthening of the social infrastructure in a community. So the idea isn't that the connected community approach is an individual intervention. A connected community approach is a series of principles and practical tools that allow the community to take its own lead on building its capacity to strengthen over time. The connected community approach posits that there are 10 keys to unlocking the potential of a connected community. They all work together. And I'd like to just draw your attention there to key number 8. And this is really, I think, the crux of what we're talking about when we're talking about community-centered resilience. When we talk about things like asset-based community development and various community-driven initiatives, they tend to be all about residents and resident leadership, which is critical to the connected community approach and community-centered resilience, but it's not sufficient. Working at multiple scales means that you're working simultaneously on high-level policy and city and provincial strategies, while centering those policies and strategies on the real work of real people who are designing for themselves, and the capacity of people on the ground to leverage big systems to actually achieve what has been identified by the community for success. All the keys work together, and that is a number of courses that talk about exactly how they do that. But in this particular case, I think that the big hurdle to overcome and the big key that will unlock the potential of community-centered resilience is the prioritization of equity and power sharing. What we often see is municipalities have internal processes that might be informed by the public with the best of intentions, but are not actually designed to shift any power to communities to act autonomously and to advise the city on how to move forward in ways that actually prioritize equity in their strategies. So in the context of community-centered resilience, and Ismail will give you an on-the-ground, much sort of more holistic approach to this, but this gives you a bit of a sense of what we're talking about. What we're talking about is in a community, an entity or entities whose sole responsibility is for ensuring that communication, coordination, and leveraging of assets work across players in the community ecosystem and leverage resources, communications, and relationships from multiple scales. So through that city and provincial strategy piece. So here we have the centralized in the community, not for the community from the city, but in the community, social infrastructure that is doing the network weaving to make sure everything is working coordinated on the ground. That includes emergency responses. It includes the expertise that doesn't necessarily reside in the community, but needs to be leveraged and brought in. I know when we first talked about this, there was a sense of, well, are residents going to be trained to do what city first responders do? That's not the idea. The idea is, how do you leverage the professional first responders and other professions in ways that are informed by, connected to, and in service to a community-led agenda. The grassroots response, which again Ismail will speak more to, is absolutely critical. Grassroots people who are organizing, citizen responders who are organizing much more quickly than the formalized infrastructure, and the capacity for grassroots groups to be able to be so much more effective if they can leverage the resources that are available in organizations and in the city. Right now, what we see is a lot of disconnect between the grassroots response and the kind of formalized emergency response by cities, and also to a certain extent by community-based organizations, as community-based organizations regroup and figure out what new normal means given the shock. The ability for community organizations to be informed by the immediacy and in real time of grassroots groups needs some intentionality behind it. And so I draw you back to this beautiful drawing that Imara was speaking of, and we had just gotten underway. Really, this exercise was about getting city divisions, and there were 10 of them. There were 10 city divisions and a number of sort of related organizations like Toronto Region Conservation Authority, that got together really to understand how they could, if they shifted their practice, support community-centered resilience. And the enthusiasm of the 100+ people in the room was quite overwhelming. The timing, however, wasn't terrific, because this happened days before COVID lockdown, and the city was in emergency management mode, dealing with the immediacy of the shock. This was still a conceptual idea and had not been put into place. But now that we're, sort of, what are we, 8 months into this particular shock, this pandemic, we're now coming back and saying, so how does this get realized? It couldn't be realized in time for COVID, but how do we dig deeper now?
Thank you, Anne. And I think the conversation is not taking place in a disconnected way. This, in terms of the model of communities being prepared, it starts a long time ago. The city has several strategies, and specifically for me in my own neighborhood, if you can look at the two pictures, one picture is the revitalized area of the neighborhood, Regent Park, and the other area is our north side of our neighborhood, which is being rebuilt. And when this neighborhood was being rebuilt through revitalization, it wasn't only a physical development, it was a social component to it as well. And there was a strategy called the Region Park Social Development Plan that went along with the physical development plan. And at the time, the city's Toronto Strong Neighborhood Strategy was being developed, and our neighborhood was a neighborhood improvement area, and so we had a table. In that table, a vision was created, and at the time, I was taking part of the Local Champions program that the city was developing, and I learned about the connected community approach there. And as a student of philosophy and what do you call, I fell in love with it at first sight because it talked about bringing everybody at the same table in a neighborhood where you are marginalized, in a neighborhood where your voice, where your capacity is questioned every time. It felt refreshing to see that not only do we have a city strategy that talks about collaboration, we have a whole what do you call theory that substantiates that. So I took part in the what do you call in the neighborhood's planning table to see what can we do with this planning table. It's a neighborhood infrastructure, and in that neighborhood infrastructure, we use these two models. We use the collaborative tables where you see people with aligned values, people with change makers, and people who are grassroots leaders, and people who are network weavers, organizations with the capacity to pull people together. And we use this with the Toronto Strong Neighborhood Strategy, which is to activate people, to activate resources, and to activate neighborhood-friendly policies. At the time, when I read these two things, I said, we have something amazing. So next slide. Based on that, this is what we've created in my neighborhood. If you can look at each of the boxes, for instance, we have a table called community building. In that table, we have parks, forestry, and recreation. We have Toronto Public Library. We have all the organizations in the neighborhood that occupy a lot of spaces in the neighborhood, service providers. And we have a lot of grassroots groups that are interested in building social cohesion and inclusivity between market residents and Toronto community housing resident. The goal of that table is to build, to bridge between the divides between residents, between market and TCH, and between organizations and residents. So the other one is the employment table. They work there. We have Toronto Employments there. We have all the organizations that do employment in the neighborhood, and we have residents who are entrepreneurs and residents who are discussing how to bring employment opportunities and leverage everyone's strength to bring neighborhood vitality. We have a communications table as well, and all the organizations that deal with communications are there as well. The Resident Neighborhood Association is active there as well. And we have a safety network table and Toronto Police, all the people that deal with safety issues, youth outreach workers, grassroots groups that deal with safety issues. They spend that table discussing neighborhood issues at a hyper local level, but connected to city leveraging and city resources. Now, this is what we've created at a neighborhood in Regent Park. Next slide. And we have this called a planning table, and the planning table's job is, because we have so many tables, you need coordination, you need strategic direction, because what can happen is you can build silos. So we have a table that coordinates all the different and aligns everybody, and almost everybody at the different tables comes to this table to make sure that we're coordinated. Next table, next slide. So if you can look at the first picture is what we were doing before COVID. This is a sample of each of the working groups, each of the tables. You see their residents, you see their Toronto community housing, you see their SDFA from the city of Toronto. You see there almost every player in the neighborhood is in that picture. We're discussing, we're organizing, we're thinking through, and we're solving problems together. However, when COVID hit, the city pulled out because of it's dealing with emergency issues, and it could no longer support the neighborhood tables because it had to respond and think through on the emergency that needs to be done. So what we did was, our infrastructure did not stop. We transitioned to Zoom. So if you can look at the same organizations, the same residents switched over to Zoom. And Toronto Community Housing is there. And the only person that was not there for us was the city. And given the emergency cases that they were dealing with and the thinking that they had to do, they pulled out in this situation. Next slide. So through coordination, because we had to respond as a community to COVID, and we do it in the way that we, that we envisioned. We leveraged the neighborhood structure and we leveraged the connected community approach. These are some of the things we were able to do. For instance, the communications table was working on to make sure that COVID safety protocols and information was being shared with residents through community-wide communication channels. We used the Region Park Social, which is an upstart by a resident that built that website to make sure that communication was shared. We used the community WhatsApp group, and we made sure that also that service changes also was being communicated through those channels, because COVID-19 restrictions made service providers' activities a little bit more restricted. So the communications table was coordinating those pieces. The employment table made sure that it adapted to the work of COVID-19 conditions and made sure to begin a community research on the new employment and entrepreneurial needs the community will need for the future. The safety network, we copied what was done in another neighborhood, because I'm a local champion and I'm connected to other neighborhoods, the neighborhood pods. Through partnerships with Toronto Community Housing and organizations in the neighborhood, we set up 3 neighborhood pods where neighbor to neighbor could share resources, could in a safe way as well. We made sure that there were safety protocols in place when this was done, so that neighbor to neighbor infection doesn't happen. And this was done because we had organizations from the community health center informing resident leadership on how this should be done well. We made sure that there was an escalating model for addressing needs, so that if a resident to resident can be met, that's great. If the need is higher, it was shifted to organizations. And if that did not work, we made sure to connect with city cluster tables that the city was forming. Next slide. And lastly, community building is always left, but community building resiliency is not just about safety and health, it's also about communities having fun. So the community building table made sure to create neighborhood games where resident competitions on Ladoo technology using the neighborhood association. So we had a 1 month long, competition at the neighborhood during COVID as well. So this slide talks about the activities that we did in the neighborhood. So for instance, grassroots groups, when the restrictions of COVID-19 eased, grassroots groups in partnership with businesses made sure to do community cleanup. Organizations like the Community Health Center made sure that there was COVID-19 testing done at the neighborhood. And also through partnerships with the organizations and residents, we did an anxiety and youth and adult in response to COVID. All of this was done because it leveraged the power of organizations, the residents' leadership, all in a collaborative table. Next next slide. Yeah, I'll join you later in the conclusion. But what I wanted to say was that we were leveraging our collaboration. We had a vision. We leveraged the city's infrastructure, the Toronto Strong Neighborhood Strategy, and we leveraged the connected community approach as well. And this was not easy. It took us 2 years to sort of get this going, but the preparation doesn't happen now. The preparation happened before. Thank you.
Thanks, Ismail. I hope folks on the call are getting a sense of the depth and breadth of activity at the community level. I'm so glad, Ismail, you were able to join us, because it really illustrates so clearly the community-centered approach and connected communities and the importance of that. And so recognizing that, having worked together on a couple of projects, we started working with C3 and others to develop a suite of projects that would really move the connected community approach more into the community resilience space locally and beyond. And so we've been, you'll see on the right-hand side there, seeking funding for a series of projects that do a number of different things, that provide a base of a lit review, a current research project, which I'll tell you about in a minute, and some proposals to advance racial justice framing for community resilience work that Imara is leading, and that I hope we'll have another session here in this group to talk about in the future. and connect that up with what the City of Toronto is doing, the theory of change that Anne shared earlier and that Amara spoke to as well, and the pilot projects for bringing this kind of approach in at the neighborhood level that the city is planning, but which have been put on hold for the moment because of COVID. Next slide, please. And so we currently have funding from the School of Cities and the COVID Action Research Initiative at U of T to look at what community building efforts were in place in selected neighborhoods in Toronto prior to COVID-19 that are enabling communities to respond more effectively to local needs. And this graphic just describes a little bit of how the work of the center, the university, and community knowledge kind of intersect on different aspects of the research project to enable, I guess, to show visually the benefits of this kind of collaborative undertaking, community university research collaboration, based on a series of shared co-created principles that we derived at the outset of our work together around, naming some of our assumptions going into this work, that community resilience is a community development process, not an individual or a systems only approach, that grassroots strategies and formalized professional strategies are both required to create resilient communities, and that equity is at the core of effective community resilience work, for example. Next slide, please. So we've undertaken a series of interviews in 6 racialized and low-income neighborhoods in Toronto, and a review of the gray literature over this past summer and fall, with that eye to looking at how pre-existing, how connected the community was prior to COVID and what impact that's had on its ability to mobilize and respond. And we're very early in our analysis. We're still just completing the last few interviews, but a couple of things have come forward that I wanted to share with you. One is kind of something we've been hearing from many sources, that the pandemic and responses to it have really exacerbated pre-existing inequalities along lines of race, class, gender, etc. That agencies have pulled up stakes and closed up operations quickly and often without consultation, leaving already stretched communities to somehow fill the gap. There are some key issues in terms of food security, internet access, precarious income, and communication that have been really at the core. And Ismail shared some of what's happening in Regent around this in response. That in fact there's extensive mutual aid, often against rather significant odds, and that there are innovations like the neighborhood pods that are in Parkdale and Regent, for example, that Ismail talked about, the Toronto Bike Brigade and other things that have been hatched by community, for community, and that are making a real impact on what's happening on the ground. But that unfortunately a lack of adequate support, financial and otherwise, for citizen-led responses mean that they can't quite achieve their full potential. And even modest funding and support from the city and from other formal institutions would go a really long way in extending and supporting citizen-led initiatives. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so for this slide, I think the main lesson here is not, and I think in the early time, I struggled to understand why that those with knowledge, expertise, and those with lived experience, how can they work together? I've learned through my 4 years in the neighborhood that it's been very difficult. There's certain biases, there's certain misgivings, distrust, but through a connected community approach and through building relationships together, I think those with knowledge, expertise, like organizations, like the city, I've learned that their ways of doing things are efficient. And I think that cannot be taken from them. Their expertise and their knowledge is necessary, but I would say it's not sufficient. I think we need efficiency and effectiveness. And the only way that we can be effective is if we are at the table together. Lived experience informing learned expertise. And I think what I said was that the city has multiple strategies, multiple programs. And what I would like to leave with you is that whatever strategies, structures, policies, and programs you create, it will be effective if it takes a connected community approach, and it will be efficient if you coordinate and leverage city efforts and investments. We can all do this together. And I think in many ways, this is not new. I think the TSN 2020 anticipated this, what do you call, in 2015, right? But I think we are realizing that when we work together, we can recover, respond, and in a very transformative way. Thank you.
So that's it for our formal presentation. We're happy to take questions and discussion. And
does anybody have questions for Blake or Amara or Ishmael or Anne? Or any thoughts just coming up?
I have a question for Ismail. I'm so impressed by the work you're doing in Regent Park. That's fabulous to hear. So thank you for that. Great. May it spread across every city in the country. I'd love to hear more about the neighborhood pods and what they look like and how they function and how they got started and how sustainable they are. Ismail, if you would. Thanks.
Yeah, the neighborhood pods, I think, what do you call, was an innovation that was created at Parkdale. And that innovation was, Parkdale has a long history of grassroots leadership and taking on a very collaborative approach between as the expertise that they have as professionals, but also tapping into the expertise and knowledge of residents. They have that trust. I think it's a very interesting neighborhood, and really studying that neighborhood in terms of how it does it, because I do think that they do collaboration works, and that's why whenever new innovations comes, it can be modeled elsewhere. The way it was modeled for us was actually through the Shape My City website. What do you call this? Is a tool that was developed by the Center for Connection Community, and there, what they did was they map out all the neighborhood responses of COVID. And as I was just perusing through the website, they have some tools there, they have some information there, and that's where I just saw the neighborhood pods. And the idea was amazing because it fits so well into what we wanted to do as well. And we had the neighborhood infrastructure to carry it out, because we have Toronto Community Housing residents and we have market residents. And what we did was we partnered up with Toronto Community Housing because we had buy-in from them as well. If a resident was alone or a grassroots group alone, it wouldn't be able to work. What do you call it? Through partnerships with Toronto Community Housing, because they made the calls to all their what do you call buildings, saying that would you be interested in a neighborhood pod? They recruited leaders to lead those neighborhood pods, and there was actually 2 residents that was paired up, a market resident and a TCHC resident, to lead the pods. So it was resident led, and what the organizations and the institutions played was they reinforced that with supports, with printing, with because what we call resident groups do not have the material cost for that. So the idea is that we learned from other neighborhoods. We learned from innovation, and there was a tool citywide that can connect us to that innovation. Because some ideas, great ideas, can happen elsewhere, but if you're not connected, you're not going to be able to leverage it. So I think the lesson for the neighborhood pods is that is the interconnectedness, and we need to develop ways to leverage that. Because right now, I think we're used to operating our own levels. We've become expertise at doing our own things. We really have not become we're experts at collaborating. And I think it's happening at a neighborhood level, but now it needs to happen at a citywide level.
Great, thanks very much.
And Henriette, you had a question. Are you connected to the audio?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Yeah, my question can you say something more about the role of faith communities, which appeared on your beautiful circle, um, in with respect to any of the neighborhoods that you're working with? Are there some sort of exemplary ways or really positive ways in which faith communities of all kind are part of the community connections? And are there areas where you think the faith communities themselves maybe need to do some further internal work so that they can become more sort of outward oriented in looking at what the needs are around them and how they are part of this ecosystem?
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit to that. They are part of the ecosystem by definition because they're in the ecosystem. They're part of the ecosystem, and there are it's many ways for faith communities to interact with the ecosystem as there are faith communities. My personal experience with faith communities is where the connected community approach is introduced, and where the faith community itself does some deep work to figure out what is it that we aspire to do. I think that one of the challenges with a number of other community development processes tends to be, abandon your own agenda for the sake of for a shared agenda. And what is unique about the connected community approach is it really looks at each community builder, whether they're a faith community, business, grassroots leader, organization, and asks the question, what is it that you want to contribute to the community? Who do we need to connect to in order to do that? So the immediate outward facing piece, what do we want to do? But then who else is doing stuff in the community? How can we align? How can we add value to what else is already going on in the community? And what is the learning that we get from them? So first, deep reflection, and then external, really understanding the ecosystem, who's in it. Um, I've seen faith communities do extraordinary pieces of work, either as contributing to something that is led by someone else, or taking a leadership role in things like food security. So
Yes.
it really depends on the individual faith community, and Ismail can probably give you some examples.
100%. What do you call it? What comes to mind is, at least for me, the Muslim community in my neighborhood is they are on their own path of integration, right? And right now, I think what do you call it? The generations that were born here are much more educated. They're graduating. They're starting their early careers. So the mosques are much more. They're taking on this new leadership, not in a very fast way, but in its own, what do you call, emergent way. And I remember one time a person called me and they said, well, there's funds coming through United Way, funds coming from the government. I have connections and to apply for it, but who do I connect with? And then I told them, well, we do have a mosque. We do have, because of COVID-19, all the mosques have been shut off. And I said, Ramadan is coming. People are fasting. What do you call it? Why don't you partner up with that mosque and see if you can do a food programming for the neighborhood? The reason why it made sense for the mosque, it wasn't big. They were being co-opted for another agenda. They needed creative solutions and activities for their Ramadan programming, and there was none to begin with. So that collaboration happened, and because of that, what do you call, food and meals were being prepared for the neighborhood, and spacing was needed as well. So organizations connected there as well to provide the spacing to make sure that the food was handled well. So that's only a small example of a community that's working at being collaborative, all right, and taking advantage of new opportunities. But that can only happen because there was a relationship there, right? Because I'm Muslim, because I'm connected, I offer them the opportunity to connect with another organization. So I think elsewhere these things are happening. But the question is, how do we? I think in the 10 keys, it talks about what they call building on everybody's strength. And I think the strength of faith group, what we call faith groups and organizations, is so much. And I think we have to find ways to leverage them in ways that are truthful and meaningful for all sides.
I would just add that we also have worked closely with Crew, and Sheila Murray is on this call, and one of their projects, the Lighthouse Project, worked quite specifically with faith-based organizations as resilience hubs in neighborhoods in several communities across the GTA. And I think she's mentioned that or talked about it in other sessions and for this group, but that's something that we're also aware of. And in fact, we have an article coming out about the Lighthouse Project in the Canadian Journal of Public Health next month.
And in every case, there is, people, organizations, groups who are intentionally connecting, right? So in the Lighthouse Project, that was the faith community itself. In Regent Park, that was the Regent Park Neighborhood Association, and particularly Ismail. In East Scarborough, from my background, it's the East Scarborough storefront. But there is this entity who sees it as their responsibility and mandate and role. When somebody says, I can get money, who should I connect it to? Who can say, Ramadan, the mosque, perfect timing, perfect place. I have a relationship. Let me connect you. And that's the role of Network Weaver. And I think it's critical to any of these initiatives.
Does that help to answer your question, Henriette?
Yes, it does very much. I really appreciate the examples you gave and the both and, you can initiate from the point of view of a faith community, but you have to do the deep work, or you can join something that is already out there. Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? I think we have time for maybe one more question or comment.
We had also, Natasha, I don't know where it is. I've been posting a few links in the chat box for those who keep an eyeball on these things, but we had also queued up a little resource page with a few links related to today's topic for those who want to explore more. And I'm not sure if I think that came through in the announcement for today's session, but.
I will double check and I'll make sure that gets out to everybody in the follow-up email.
Thank you.
Was there somebody else starting to say something?
Oh, sorry. Yes, it's Zoe Kavanaugh. Thanks. I guess I'm just coming from a background more of maybe traditional emergency management. So I've really, really enjoyed this and it's been quite inspiring. So thanks for sharing. I guess I'm just wondering, I guess from your perspective, or if there's someone who can speak on kind of the integration of, I guess it would be the Toronto Office of Emergency Management, or kind of what that looked like at this point, or plan to go forward.
Yeah, I can probably speak to that. We have a champion within the Emergency Management Office at the City of Toronto who was actually at the forefront of leading the process to design that theory of change and bring all the divisions together. So emergency management has actually played a leadership role here in partnership with Energy and Environment and the Resilience Office. She recognizes that within emergency management department, there are the innovators and the traditionalists, and that it is not an easy fit. And that, a little bit similar to what we said to Henrietta, it's really about the looking at, well, what are we trying to achieve? And how can we connect with communities going forward? So it can be incremental, it can be emergent. It isn't entirely overhauling the whole emergency management system, but so it kind of starting small with where are the points of intersection, what is our shared understanding of intersection. When I said earlier, the idea of our grassroots groups going to learn to take on first responder roles, and what does that mean in terms of quality and quality assurance and things like that? Those comments all came from the emergency management team. And, so it really does take the understanding that community-centered resilience does not negate the expertise of the professionals. It simply leverages them for better effect.
Yeah, thank you. That's kind of what I was thinking, but it's good to hear that you have that champion and kind of yeah, nice to hear that those people do exist within the field, because
They certainly do.
that it can be a challenge. So thank you so much for presenting today.
All right, so let's stop there. It sounds like there's there could be a whole other webinar, maybe a day on this. So I will take all of the links, and like there might be more. Make sure that all of that gets sent to everybody in the follow-up email. Anne, are you able to send me the PowerPoint slides, and I'll share those as well? There was a comment, there's lots of great information in there. I agree with that. My head is full. This was so great. I work in the area of poverty reduction, and I really appreciated seeing that, how the poverty reduction and some of those other initiatives or plans were being integrated in this kind of resiliency approach as well. When COVID-19 hit, we had all of these poverty reduction roundtables across Canada, where suddenly everything was on pause. Like some of these strategies get so granular. Everybody's committed to one action or another, and in an emergency response, a lot of seniors were in their homes. People who are immunocompromised are in their homes, and suddenly volunteers are suddenly you have a lot less volunteers. So being able to work with, I think, the assets that you have, knowing people, having those connections, following principles, building towards resiliency instead of specifically poverty reduction, like resiliency for everything, for everyone, I think really spoke to me. So thank you for your very thoughtful presentation and all of that information. There are lots of thank yous in the chat box there. And just for everybody, we have lots more learning that you can do with us with Tamarack online. There's another webinar that's coming up November 25th, and it's going to be talking about from for people to with people, creating equitable and resilient places. And then we're going to have the big, exciting virtual workshop, the ABCD conference with Cormac Russell and many others, will take place December 2nd and 3rd. That is on our website. I will send you the link afterwards so that you can register for that. Normally we do these things in person, so this is going to be our first time holding a conference online, and we're really excited to be able to, I think, gather with more people than we normally get to when we do it in person. So looking forward to that one. And just one last thank you to all of our presenters today, everybody who joined and asked questions or just listened in. You can email heather@tamarackcommunity.ca if you have any feedback, and have a great rest of your day, everyone. Have a good weekend. Hope to see you again soon.